What do you call your significant other's parents? Story 1. Funny. My sister calls her in-laws mom and dad to their faces, but she hates them, so it makes me cringe. I just think it would be less hypocritical if she called them by their first names. Story 2. From my own experience, in the UK, you call your partner's parents by their first names. Your partner usually calls them mum and dad. There is a chance that your partner's parents will insist you are much more formal and use Mr. and Mrs. Waterworth Elasnomize. Titles such as Sir, Lord, Lady, etc. may also be required. If you feel really comfortable with your partner's parents, the option to call them mum and dad is there if they are okay with that. Another alternative is to call them whatever the grandkids call them, especially if the kids are yours. My dad is called Gumpy, and mom, she's American and my stepmother. So mom differentiates her from my mom, is called Grandy. Using these terms myself helps to differentiate between my dad and my kid's dad, and the three grandmothers, although Grandy is the only one they have contact with. Story 3. Current significant other's parents aren't living, but I called my ex's parents by their first names. They were cool with that. I would have called them Mr. and Mrs. if they preferred, but not mom and dad. I already had a mom and dad. Story 4. My situation is odd. I call her folks by their first names. But here is the rub. Both are your typical Midwest Catholic families for generations. My parents and her parents are John and Mary and John and Mary. My real thoughts and my wife's name are the male and female gendered versions of the same, also holy, name. Many people have been doing this is my brother Daryl and my other brother Daryl, to us the entire time she was alive. I would tell you how scary close our last names were too. But I do not want people I know to find me on Reddit. I will tell you there are between 1 and 3 letters difference. Like one of us had the surname with a suffix tacked on. Think Charles and Charleston or Williams and Williamson. Story 5. My mother-in-law is the last parent to be still alive, so I started calling her mom after my mom passed earlier this year. I've been her daughter-in-law for over 25 years and have always called her by her first name. She was so thrilled that she got teary and beams every time I say, "This is my mom. I'm lucky to have had great in-laws." Story 6. I'm pretty close with my in-laws. Depending on the situation, how I address them can vary. To my father-in-law, we have a thing where we greet each other with, "Hello, Mr. Insert first name." When I speak to him directly, it's always sir. With my mother-in-law, it's mostly the equivalent of auntie, but in our language or culture. I also run their company, so professional emails are always addressed by using their first names. Story 7. I was introduced to them as Papa and Tootie, which is what the grandkids call them. All the adults call them that. My husband calls them that. They call each other that. My brother-in-law's new wife calls them by their first names, which is hilarious because she was a family friend for like 20 years before they got married and used to call them Papa and Tootie, too. My husband doesn't call my parents anything. Story 8. Mom and Dad. My own family was so awful that whoever I told about them either didn't believe me that it was that bad, or they hated them. They have sort of adopted me. I still struggle with the concept of family, and every time I don't automatically trust or shy away, they look a little hurt. But I'm doing what I can. Story 9. While reading some of these answers, the idea popped in my head. In 60 to 70 years, if all this sex/gender stuff actually carries on into the future, I would like to see the myriad of randomness that would occur from the same question being asked. Story 10. My mother-in-law asked me to call her by her name. We are Latin American, so I don't treat her like usted. I call her by her name and tu. In my country, it's called tudio. It usually applies when the relationship is closer in age or more open. My father-in-law hates his name, so I call him sugro, which in Spanish means father-in-law, and I talk to him with more respect. I use usted when I talk to him. Story 11. I don't have a significant other, but my brothers-in-law call my parents by their name if they have to get their attention. Otherwise, they just stand really close to them and talk at them. My brother's girlfriend, on the other hand, has been calling our parents second mom, other mother, or just mom. And my dad she calls other dad or old man. He's the youngest of both our parents and hers, and he complains that he's old. It's very entertaining. Story 12. I call them by their first names, but I am their only daughter-in-law that does not call them mom and dad. I do not think they care, but I think the other siblings-in-law think it is weird or rude. Story 13. I have a kind of funny story. So, I'm Asian, and it's kind of just a thing where everyone's mom and dad, you call them auntie or uncle. When I first started my relationship with my boyfriend, I had extreme confusion about what to call his parents. The Asian part of me wanted to call them auntie and uncle, while the part of me who grew up in the United Kingdom knew that was weird, and I should call them by their first names. Well, I've been with my boyfriend, now husband, for 8.5 years, and I've still managed to avoid referring to his parents by anything. I haven't called them by their first name. I haven't called them auntie or uncle, and I haven't even called them mom or dad. Story 14. 9 years of marriage, and I don't call them anything. We don't have the type of relationship where I feel comfortable calling them mom and dad. They're also not my mom and dad, and it would feel so unnatural for me to say. They, or at least my mother-in-law, would hate if I used their first names. So yeah. Story 15. Now that I've realized, I've never actually said her name in person. Like, she'll peek in the room if I'm there while he's at work to see if I need anything. But other than that, we usually just have short conversations. Story 16. Mom is mother-in-law. She's literally like a mom to me, more so than my actual biological parent, so I affectionately call her my mom, and she refers to me as her daughter. I'm very happy to have her in my life. Name her partner. Super chill and nice guy. No issues with him, but he's not my partner's dad, and my relationship with him, as amazing as it is, isn't dad status. Hey is my way around not asking what my father-in-law wants to be called. He is a nice guy too, don't get me wrong. Very kind and good with our daughter when we see him, but it's awkward. He's not nearly as talkative or goofy as mom is. So it feels still like a just meeting the parents vibe every time despite knowing him for nearly a decade. He's not dad to me the way mom is mom to me, yet calling him by his name feels way too informal, and calling him Mr. Last Name feels way too formal. So for now, and maybe for the rest of his life, it will be, hey. Story 17. I have never addressed them in any way. I just say, oh hey man, hey buddy. Like I feel like I am in too deep, so Mr. or Mrs. X sounds too formal. Going on 5 years with my fiancée, soon-to-be wife. Story 18. Either first names or, if the little grandkids are around, their grandparent names. I didn't like mom and dad because I have a great relationship with my parents and I wasn't going to use those names with anyone else. Story 19. To their faces, nothing. I totally avoid it. But about them to others, I will refer to them as my partner's mom, my partner's dad. I don't call them by their names because it feels weird. They never really introduce themselves by name to me. It's too intimate. I can't call them parental titles because that's also too intimate. My language doesn't have any handy names built in for it. I can't say Mr. X/Ms. X because it's too formal, and society has moved away from that sort of formality. Story 20. Their first names. I feel super weird calling people Mr. or Mrs. in my 30s unless they're a client, and even then, it's odd. I'm always very confused when people address me as Miss or Mrs., and I have to tell them to use my first name. Story 21. I call my mother-in-law mom. It just came out one day and it hasn't stopped. She loves it. Her husband, my husband's stepdad, always goes by Rick, even with all the kids. I called him dad once, and he looked like his heart melted. So, it's just been a thing. Story 22. Their first names, they are not my parents, and whereas they are nice to me, I shouldn't expect they will care for me in any real capacity compared to my parents. Just happy I have good in-laws. Her family, even with a language barrier, goes pretty above and beyond for me. Story 23. Dr. Mama insisted that I call her Mother Doctor, and her mother was insistent that I call her Mama and not by her name. I don't call her Dad anything because, for the past 2 years, he has always been out of the house whenever I visit. Story 24. I was married for 7 years, divorced, and have been dating someone new for almost a year now. I have always called my in-laws and girlfriend's parents by their first names. Calling them Mom and Dad just felt really cringy. Story 25. I'm sure they would love me to call them mom and dad, but I have parents whom I love and my in-laws are not great. For a while, I just avoided it by speaking generally, but when we had kids, it gave me a nice excuse. Now they're Opa and Granny, and I'm off the hook. Story 26. Outlaws. We have been together for 17 years, but we are not married. I get along well with his parents, so they usually call me their daughter-in-law when talking to other people about me. I call them outlaws mostly, occasionally in-laws. When addressing them, I call them by their given names. Story 27. First names when I am talking directly to them. If I am talking about them to someone else, I usually refer to them as in-laws. I have been dating the same woman since 2010, and I call her my partner because the term girlfriend doesn't seem to carry enough weight to me. Story 28. I don't speak directly to them without using any title or name, living in constant fear of the day when I'm supposed to address them somehow. When discussing them with other people, their significant other's parents. Story 29. I'll translate the titles since our families are not native English speakers. Technically, we're supposed to call them auntie and uncle before we get married, and mom and dad after we get married. That's what most people do. Realistically, though, I don't call them anything, and they haven't pressed the issue. I'm sure first names would be unacceptable, though. My husband calls my stepdad family name uncle, mainly because my stepdad is a family friend of theirs, and he was taught to call him that from the time he was a kid. He doesn't call my mom anything because he also finds it awkward. In front of other people, he calls my mom my name's mom, and I call his parents his name's parents/mom/dad. Story 30. First names when speaking to them one-on-one, grandma/grandpa when the kids are involved. I do not see myself ever calling my mother-in-law mom and find the idea deeply offensive, but could see calling my father-in-law dad possibly. Story 31. I've known my in-laws since I was 14, so I used to call them Mr/Mrs. followed by their first name. But now, being in my 30s and married to their son for over a decade, it feels awkward. However, I also don't feel right calling them by just their first names. I'm partially thrilled to have a baby just so I can use grandma and grandpa.